Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative perspective about the world around me. Feedback is immensely important. Feel free to reach out to me. 2 ways to do this is through email and YouTube. Comments and feedback is greatly important. It helps with the development of the channel. Just, feel free. Alright, so word of mouth really helps, and I appreciate all the listeners out there. You feel like somebody would be really interested in my content, share and let them know about the Harboring Light. Okay, so on to the topic of choice here. So I'm going to give my thoughts about the aspects of extend out what I was saying on Monday about comic books. Here we go. Alright, so I'm going to extend out what I was initially talking about with comic strips and versus the Victorian era, with the Victorian era and penny dreadfuls and everything else. It's quite interesting because how those things interlink themselves. So penny dreadfuls were initially something that is a UK based thing, and it's very interesting because that is the overlying theme of Victorian era content. And then going back to, it was presented in the aspects of being pristine, being refined and everything else with, from the American point of view. But Pennywise was penny dreadfuls here was really interesting because it was the counterculture of everything that was going on in the Victorian era, because it was addressing issues that about the middle class and the aspects. A really good example that comes out of this is Sweeney Todd, right? Now, there has been the adaptation that Tim Burton did, but I would suggest seeing in the theatrical version and then, compare and contrast. But, to each his own. That's just a mere suggestion here. And so what Sweeney Todd was the aspects of going into death, but being very, creative, let's say that, or artistic with the aspects about the mayhem and drudgery of urban life, and particularly in the ways in which would be really relatable to people who were middle class. And these things would not be understandable for the most part of people who what the Victorian era was presenting. For the most part, with the Victorian era was addressing people who were more prestige, who had the means and the aspects of understanding. Now, needless to say, people who are middle class won't get the importance of being modest and refined and all of these things. But those things are more would in this day and time and so forth. Realistically, if we're having honest conversations about it, would be more obtainable for people who have money versus those who don't. And so, that's where the penny dreadfuls come in to really address and entertain issues that would be relatable. And so going back to Sweeney Todd here, Sweeney Todd was a means in which was making a lot of commentary about the aspects of crime and justice, and what do you do when you're put in a situation where it's not really clear on who is in the right and who is in the wrong, with that moral ambiguity of what where we are as a consciousness, with a culture. And I would suggest that the stage production of it with Angela Lansbury that was really on point because, yeah, I mean, I grew up I was a kid in the 90s. So I'll reiterate this again. I was a kid in the 90s, and, that was just something really interesting with the aspects of there was a lot of different variety and entertainment and things that you could see on TV. So Angela Lansbury to me was the lady who was a quintessential, not too far away from the Agatha Christie sort of aspects of crime mystery, which was interesting enough. I was reading stuff like that in the 4th grade, so that's one of those things. Those things were, I paid attention to stuff like that. So that is the framework of which I understood her from, and then also with the aspects of Disney really becoming its own in the 90s more so. With the aspects of children's entertainment. Her work that she was graced with Disney, with Beauty and the Beast, and with the pot, and I'm trying to think about her project, but yeah, with the teacup and everything else, why I bring her up and why I would suggest that to watch that theatrical adaptation of Sweeney Todd is this, because she was able to really give a lot of depth into the reality of the situation of what her character was about in Sweeney Todd. And that was what was very interesting about Angela Lansbury. She was really, the roles in which she took, she really was able to evoke the depth of those characters in a relatable way, and then, when we get into the aspects of Disney, and Disney, was in the heart of the matter, with Walt Disney here, he was interested in telling stories that were not very friendly, but making it general audience where, different people could take something out of it, but it was suitable, appropriate. It wasn't what it is today, where it's highly focused on the extreme side of counterculture, to where it's off-putting, it's polarizing, and that's unfortunate. And when we get a movie like Beauty and the Beast, when it came out when I was a kid, they had the hints of feminism in it with, Belle and how the director or what have you, the director producer of that, I believe was either the writer or the director was female, and pushing the aspects of Belle being more feminist, right? And so, but when Angela Lansbury's character was, crossing in between that aspect of being very delicate and protective, but delicate at the same time, of the importance of family, and that was evoked in her character. So, how does this all relate into the aspects of what I was saying? What am I starting out back with the Victorian era, and then the difference of things that were coming out at the time with the aspects of comics and penny dreadfuls from the UK, and then more refined things that were, with the aspects of ladies' home journals and illustrations, and talking about things that were relatable to the upper class, and what was going on in the UK versus America and so forth. It all pinpoints to the aspect of the formation of comics, right? Because comics when it initially started to really become its own, when we get into the silver and golden era of comics. It was all of these things were leading to the aspects of what comics were all about, and what should be reminded about comics. It's a platform and a means and to, for the most part, flip a lens or capture something and go into depth and really examine what do these things mean from a cultural, what do these things mean for a cultural perspective of what does it mean to uphold justice, or what does it mean to be different, or what does it mean to be a superhero? What are these things translate to? And how does culture translate these things to be informative or interesting to an audience? Those are what are very interesting and what comics can give to a culture. So with that said, I'm going to go into even more depth and give more examples about the aspects of comic books from the golden and silver era. Here we go. Okay, so let's get into the silver and golden age of comic books here. So initially, that was the start and the establishment of what we know today as comics. When we get anywhere from Batman, DC, Marvel, that was all when everything was initiating itself as far as the standard rule for comics. And also, that's when it was implemented with the aspects, and I'll have the link where I'm getting my source from, the implement of, now I'm paraphrasing everything to just get straight to the point here, the implementing the standard rule of regulation for comics at this time too, because it's one of those things where this easy blame on something where, this is the means of upheaval for juvenile delinquency or of youth gone wild. And so now, I said this before, and I'll reiterate it again. All of this reminds me a lot of. Now, that's actually a theory. Now, it's a theory, case in point, because theories, are just a thought. It's not actually a method, because that's what we need to keep in mind with the aspects of, burden of proof, or real proof if this is actually effective or not. And then it's one of those things that just a knee-jerk reaction to, also with generational differences of not understanding something and saying, that's the source of the problem. So getting back to the point of what I was saying about this theory. So there's a communication theory that states about cultivation. And so what it said, from my point of view, from what I understand, and then what I studied about it, is this thing where, because it takes into consideration, with the aspects of children being very accessible and to being persuaded to believe things and being influenced by things more than adults. But it's also, see, that's why it's a theory. What's lacking with this theory is it's not taking into consideration the aspects of parental influence. See, that's what needs to be very mindful, when we talk about a situation like this with, what is the rhyme and reason for a young person to do something that is just not acceptable at all as far as being a part of society or being productive in society. What are the underlying effects or causes of these things, right? Because that's what needs to be understood heavily. Like, what are the influences? And most of the time, when they say, oh, well, do this knee-jerk thing where, well, not, if they, cartoon violence or, in this case, comic books and violence or, different things. If there's no, that it's all that way, and it all has to be banned. It's just an outright thing. And I don't know. I see that's really in itself in respect when you think about things from an adult perspective. That's pretty immature, because that's taking into consideration that everything in life is black and white when it's most of the time it's not. And you also, it's discounting and discrediting the source material, right? And it's also discounting and discrediting parental influence, and also discounting and discrediting the influence of good role models and the lack of understanding of good home training. Because if that's not there, if children are just left to their own discretion, and there's no reasonable adult, whether it be the actual parents or the guardian, then hey, that's going to be an issue too within itself. So I think that's what needs to, but that's very, when those things were established, it helped to also flourish a reputation for comics books too, in which people started to, over time, it started to get more and more and more of notice, and people started to take interest of it, because they were setting up rules and regulations to say, okay, we take what we're doing very serious, because that's initially what it was. That was the forethought for all these artists, among Stan Lee, so many others, where DC versus Marvel, they wanted to all come together and find a new means and ways in which art and entertainment can be art and new ways of entertaining, where it can shape the aspects of culture and give social awareness. And now these things were really showcasing itself, when we get into DC and the beginning stages of DC. We get with when we talk about Wonder Woman, and then when we talk about Superman, because Wonder Woman and Superman were all forming themselves around the aspects of what do you do when it comes to obtaining justice, right? But the aspects of the superhero, influence was heavily there, right? They were superheroes. They were non-human. And, I was trying to find that, but I'll still keep looking for that. But I was hitting a wall, so y'all feel free to reach out to me. But most of the stuff that I was finding about the aspects of the superhero in Greek mythology was doing a compare and contrast with the actual mythological, big heavy hitters when it comes to Greek mythology, and and doing thesis about that, and stuff like that. When you look at it from the point of view, a lot of it, when it comes to comic books, the ones that were highly influential, where it gets with Superman, then we get with Wonder Woman, and then we get with Batman. I'll get to Batman. The overall arc of the storytelling, it has to do with comedy and tragedy. And so that's what is heavily involved when it comes to Greek mythology. Now, it all has to do with the consensus of moral obligations to something, and then what happens when those moral obligations are skewed. And most of the time, when we look to Greek mythology, there's not a whole lot of, sort of putting your line in and saying, okay, this is where we need to find the higher ground here. Most of the time that's not the case of what's going on with Greek mythology. But it's interesting how those ideas, translate themselves into comic books. You can see that time and time again. Case in point, a really good example of that, which crosses in to how you can see DC really evolving itself into its own when Batman came along. So Batman was a really good example of, what do you do when you don't have superhuman strength, but you have superhuman strength in the means of monetary ways. With Bruce Wayne, with the tragedy of losing his parents at such a young age, that called him to the active duty of, what do you do when you, in the midst of horrific tragedy, and then what does justice mean to everyone else, to everybody, and with Batman, that was a really good example of the aspects of crossing the line in between gray area of when we're talking about when it you're kind of obsessed with the aspect. You can argue that point with Bruce Wayne, with the actions that he took, and the older he got, when he was uprooting justice, did he want to? Was he losing? What was going on with his mental state? Was it still a part of him trying to find truth and justice and trying to find who actually did this and wiped his and destroyed his his family dynamic, or was he just obsessed with the aspects of tongue tied here, taking justice in his own hands? What are the means of all of these things? And they were playing themselves out time and time again as the comic book evolved, and these different themes of right and wrong and what were the ambiguities of that were really showcasing itself a lot. And then, when you get with the aspects of noir and crime and violence, there were so many different examples of what does that actually mean with the aspects of decency, and then finding an audience for that. When you get with the Dick Tracy's, when you get with the Spirit, when you get with I'm trying to think here. When you get along the lines of all of mostly everything that was going on in Marvel, when we X-Men, when we get with the Avengers, when you have so many countless cases, and X-Men is really good example of that. Of what is that also, and then the Hulk, and that Hulk is another. I'll get back to X-Men, but the Hulk is another really good example of the aspects of coming to terms with science and the emotions of being frustrated with trying to evolve in the world around you, and the emotional undertones of that split personality of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but being more in depth in the perspective of it with Hulk, because the Hulk versus Bruce Banner, and trying to be more give more of an engagement in the aspects of that. It's not so simple of somebody just being a mad scientist and them trying to do something, like a case in point too with Frankenstein's monster. It's not all that ghoulishness. When you read Frankenstein and everything else, you come and understand there's more to it than what is presented mainly when it comes to mainstream adaptations of that book. But so X-Men was saying what is it like when you don't look like everyone else, you don't have the ability as everyone else, and people remind you of that in the wrong way. Now, being a superhero, when it comes to things of that manner, you get the nobility. Oh, you're protecting us. We care about you because you're saving us, and the accolades with that. Now, what happens when you have different abilities, but it's not the abilities that is convenient for the masses, or you just don't fit the mold, right? That's what the X-Men was really diving in deep about. It was saying, well, all these characters here, they're really coming in turmoil and trying to figure out, their disposition of how to make that work for them. And then that's in the aspects of Xavier, and his thought process of, oh, well, this is what we need to do in order to find a means in a way in which they can all coexist, where it be the mutants and the humans. And so when we get into the more modern, beyond 1970, we get more into modern takes of comic books. That's when it was an explosion of thoughts and ideas. The Punisher is a really good example of this, and that Preacher. Preacher. Both of them. So the Punisher was reacting the idea of, what do you do again when you lose everything so brutally? How do you take that into your own hands? And then internalizing that struggle and seeing things, how it evolves itself with the aspects of what's the justifiable means of this violence, right? And then with Preacher, and then see, and then when you get Love and Rockets and so many different other ones, Love and Rockets was really interesting because it was focusing on the aspects of what is the influence of music and culture, and how does that shape our thought process about that in everyday life, and how do we merge those things together. And then with Preacher, it was really pushing the envelope with the aspects of, you have a calling, you have a religious calling. You read because the main character, because I'm going back in my mind thinking about the comic book, but flipping it on its head by saying, well, maybe, there are some bad faith characters when it comes to the aspects of religion, and maybe, there is no means in which, in saying there's a savior to protect you. Maybe he has his own interest involved in these things. And then when you get to I'm trying to think about it in my mind about the aspects of everything. The Mask, right? And comics like that. Saying, well, okay, look, let's examine the aspects of noir, crime and violence, and let's really make it a point to say, oh yeah, hey, actually showcase cartoon violence for what it is, right? What you presume it what the to assume of the gore, the brutal gore of it, and these things were showcased when it comes to in modern adaptations of comics, and you can see how and why and which, and the means in which comics start to be more and more accessible. Beyond, there was these illustrations, particularly that was more of interest to children, and then start to evolve and become a whole thing where adults started to pay attention to the overall message of these comics and relate and understand. And then it started to become a thing where it evolved in its own culture. And at first, it was just not perceived all that well, because it was this connotation of not understanding something and saying, because unfortunately, You know, just because that doesn't necessarily mean that's the means of who these people who it attracts. Where this whole thing, where was a negative it was very for a long time it was a negative connotation to be considered a nerd, because when you were considered a nerd back, when you get into going back to the golden age and golden silver age of comics, and then all the way into the 80s and so, and then then it started to change when the 90s started to hit in. For the most part, when it comes to sci-fi, when it comes to comics, it was just seen as something. Well, that's somebody who's doesn't want to grow up, who's perpetually going to be with their parents and not gonna, really have a real life. That's just it for them. When, in case in point, it's just one of those things of not understanding that there's not everything is black and white, like that. There are things that are straightforward, translucent like that, but humans in themselves are very complicated, because all these things, and then just because you happen to be highly intelligent and you like sci-fi doesn't mean that you're like some kind of loser or whatever. And so, as these things started to shape and take involve, and people, the mainstream media started to latch onto this and take notice of it, this dynamic, the dynamic started to shift. And then that's when you start to get the aspects of summer popcorn fodder sort of big box movies, where it comes with the superhero movies, and that initiated the interest to start, sci-fi, maybe that's not a bad thing, maybe comic books aren't a bad thing, let's check into it. And then here we go with this. Since the overall, well, now some people can argue, and I think you can say that too, with the it's oversaturated now, which is unfortunate. But it's just interesting how the shift changed in the aspects of how influential comic books have been on shaping our culture, and how that in itself started with the humble beginnings, with finding a means to entertain the masses when it comes to newspapers, and then subjugating things with what would be more entertaining to this certain group versus your social status and so forth. Quite interesting. All right, so this reaches the end of the Harboring Light. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to. Now, the best way to do that is through email and YouTube, as I mentioned again in the beginning of the episode. All right, so tune in, turn up, and definitely take care. Bye-bye for now.